An out-of-control Chinese rocket is hurtling back to Earth. When will we know where it's going to land? The Chinese have launched two Long March 5B rockets in the past year. Both have plummeted out of control back to Earth. Space agencies are tracking the path of the Chinese rocket that is predicted to fall back to Earth sometime in the next few days. Last week, the Long March 5B rocket launched the first stage of the Chinese space station Tianhe into low Earth orbit. Under international guidelines, rockets are supposed to return to Earth in a controlled way, but the 30-meter-long rocket is spiraling out of control, weighing around 22.5 tons. It's one of the most massive pieces of space junk to make an uncontrolled re-entry to Earth. This is probably among the top 10 largest objects to come down in one piece, said space junk expert Ted Muehlhaupt of the Aerospace Corporation, a non-profit organization that advises U.S. government space and defense agencies. The rocket is about twice the mass of the Chinese space station Tiangong-1, which plunked back to Earth in 2018. But at this stage, no one has got a good idea about when and where it might land. Aerospace Corporation has been using publicly available radar data supplied by surveillance network to plot and predict the rocket's return. At the time of writing, they predicted the rocket would fall to Earth at lunchtime this Sunday, give or take a day or so. Others have given a time range of between 11 a.m. on Saturday and 5 a.m. on Monday. But expect that to change as new data comes in. The Long March 5B is one of the newest and heaviest rockets in the Chinese fleet. This was specifically designed to launch their new space station, Mr. Muehlhaupt said. This is not the first time this type of rocket, known as a CZ-5B, has plummeted back to Earth in an uncontrolled way. The Long March 5B rocket is designed to launch modules of the new Chinese space station into low Earth orbit. On its first flight exactly a year ago, the prototype of this rocket launched an uncrewed module into low Earth orbit. While that proved it could lift modules into space, the rocket was sent spiraling back to Earth in an uncontrolled orbit. It landed in the Atlantic Ocean, but debris from the rocket landed near a village on the Cote d'Ivoire in the West Africa. Luckily, there was no casualties. Since that, the space community had been speculating about whether the same thing would happen again, said space journalist Andrew Jones, who follows the Chinese program. We were wondering this time whether they would do the same thing again, where they have an uncontrolled re-entry or they had upgraded the booster, Mr. Jones said. The chance of getting taken out of the rocket is very slim. About 3/4 of the Earth is covered by water, and a large chunk of the part that is not is sparsely inhabited. The odds of it landing in an inhabited area are not great, Mr. Muehlhaupt said. While there have been some tales of near misses, only one person in the entire history of spaceflight has been hit by debris, Mr. Muehlhaupt said. Lottie Williams of Oklahoma lived to tell the tale of being stuck on the shoulder by a small piece of rocket in 1997. And saying that the rocket's orbit covers an area between 42 degrees north and south, that's as far as north as Boston and as far south as Hobart. A great big chunk of the world's population is under it, he said. It orbits around Earth about 15 times a day, covering a slightly differing patch of the planet each orbit. A number of websites such as orbit.ing-now use radar data to show you in real time where the rocket is over Earth. On maps, this looks like a wave, but in reality the rocket is moving like a corkscrew oscillating in altitude. As time goes on, it moves closer and closer to Earth. At the moment, the aerospace map shows all of the possible ground tracks and the time frame the rocket is predicted to land. But as the expected entry date draws closer, the number of the tracks on the map will decrease. We may not be able to tell you where it's going to land, but we can start to rule out huge swatches of the world where it's not going to land, Mr. Mulehaupt said. Predicting when and where the rocket will come down is tricky. As of today, the rocket is predicted to fall somewhere off the West Australian coast, but this could change a lot as more data comes in. The position of the spacecraft changes along the way as it gets closer to Earth. As the atmosphere gets thicker, there is more drag and the rocket will start to drop faster. On average, the rocket is moving at around 7 km per second. That's one of the reasons it's so hard to predict, Mr. Mulehaupt said. If you get the prediction wrong by 1 minute, it's half a continent away. Pinning down the precise position of the spacecraft is also hindered by gaps in radar or telescope tracking and the fact the rocket is tumbling, so it's harder to get an accurate read. The other thing that really drives this is the sun, which causes the atmosphere to expand and contract, changing the amount of drag on the rocket. As the space junk closes in, it does get easier to predict, but it's still not precise. If I am predicting a day out, I'm usually good at saying within a couple of, Mr. Mulehaupt said. If I'm predicting a few hours out, I am pretty good at predicting which hemisphere it's going to land in. But it's still a whole hemisphere. What happens when a rocket comes back to Earth? Once a piece of space junk hits around 120 km from the Earth's surface, it starts to burn up, creating a spectacular fireball. As it re-enters, it peels apart like an onion, scattering debris across a distance of up to 500 km.
It is in the
First
next
to
couple
go
of
are
days, but in
lightweight
terms of
things
where,
like
is it
insulation
potentially
and empty
dangerous to us in
tanks.
Canada?
Lightweight things tend to slow
Fortunately
down
for us, the
quicker,
U.S.
so fall first,
Skylab
while
fell
heavier and
and
denser
landed,
things
parts
such
of it
as
landed in
engine tend to
Australia
fall
in the
later,
outback, and
Mr.
even for
Mulehaupt
China
said. These items
last month,
often tend to
a part
survive
of
the
their first.
re-entry because they are too big to melt. And a rocket body, maybe 40% of the structure will survive, he said. Using that rule, he estimates around 8 tons of material from the Chinese rocket will fall back to Earth intact. Mr. Mulehaupt said a number of objects were photographed near the African village when the prototype CZ-5B rocket crashed back to Earth last year. The biggest piece I saw was a pipe that was at least 4 meters long and probably about 10 centimeters in diameter, and it came down like a spear. It is unknown whether or not the rocket is carrying any chemicals that could cause environmental damage, but Mr. Mulehaupt said it was unlikely to be carrying the types of more toxic propellants used to keep other types of spacecraft in orbit. The very first piece of the space junk was the rocket that launched Sputnik, the first Russian satellite in 1957. Back then we used to leave rockets in space, but Mr. Mulehaupt said the chance of them exploding and creating a shower of space junk was too high. Today, countries are supposed to follow guidelines set by the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee about managing risk. That's why when a large object is going to come in, you want to put it someplace where people are not, Mr. Mulehaupt said. Usually that's in a place in the South Pacific Ocean, quaintly known as the spacecraft cemetery. Today's rockets are designed so that they can be controlled by firing the motor to turn the rocket around or installing extra motors and gyroscopes to guide them back to Earth. Some companies such as SpaceX are also moving to reuse rockets rather than ditching them. That's expensive and difficult, and there are things that can go wrong with that, Mr. Mulehaupt said, citing the recent breakup of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket over Portland in the Northwest Pacific. But most of the world has been launching rockets where they deliberately re-enter rocket back to Earth. Astrophysicist Jonathan M.C. Dowell said it was unacceptable to let the rocket, which is 7 times bigger than the Falcon 9 rocket, to re-enter in an uncontrolled way. Since 1990, nothing over 10 tons has been deliberately left in orbit to re-enter uncontrolled, he told Space News. The Chinese Space Agency plans to launch 2 more stages of the space station next year using the same type of rocket.